All right, today we're going to test and review the Multicomp Pro UHF VHF outdoor TV antenna, model number MP011354. Out of the box, the assembly was pretty simple. Some of the sections are pre-assembled and just snap into place with spring-loaded clips. Others use a carriage bolt and wing nut, so there's really no need for any tools. The only thing I had to use a wrench on was the mast clamp, a 10mm wrench to bolt it in place. Size-wise, this antenna is 35 inches long, 32 inches at its widest point on those back reflectors, and about 21 inches high on these UHF reflectors. Despite the fact this is a smaller antenna, it is a little bulky and has some weight to it. This TV antenna is designed for high VHF channels 7 to 13 and UHF channels 14 to 36. On the front, you have these angled directors for the UHF channels. They bring the signal to these bow tie elements for channels 14 to 36. These longer dipoles are for channels 7 to 13 on high VHF. These wider reflectors are for the UHF channels, and these longer reflectors on the back here are for the VHF channels 7 to 13. These VHF reflectors are weird. They're collapsible for some reason, but there's no practical reason for this. They should be built as one piece. They're supposed to be about 5% longer than the active element anyways to work as reflectors. The only reason I can think of the company doing this would be to lower the cost of making this antenna, but all that does is make the build of this antenna a little more flimsy. You're never going to have these collapsed anyways, so why not just make them one solid piece? Something I like is this integrated 75 ohm coax connector. I've just got the antenna flipped upside down to show you this. This is a little more convenient than having to worry about securing transformer baling wires. Something very unusual is the orientation of these rear reflectors. They appear to be backwards, but that's how the manufacturer suggests they go on in the instructions, as well as pictured here on the box. We're going to find out if there's any difference between having these oriented like this or in the more traditional forward manner during the signal testing. I'm sure some of you noticed right away that this Multicomp Pro antenna bears a strong resemblance to the Televes V-Zenit Mix outdoor TV antenna. They both have these angled front directors. They have active elements that look very similar. They have the UHF and VHF reflectors on the back, except the Multicomp Pro has them angled the opposite way. That's pretty much where the comparisons stop though. The Multicomp Pro is slightly smaller than the V-Zenit Mix. Not to mention the finishing on the V-Zenit is much finer. All the parts are nicely machined. That's not necessarily the case with the Multicomp Pro. Not to mention the Televes model has LTE filtering, a proprietary chipset, as well as full shielding continuity, and that cool yellow color as well. The Multicomp Pro has none of those things. With the obvious physical characteristics aside, it's important to know that by buying this Multicomp Pro antenna, you're not getting an antenna that is equivalent to the Televes model, if that's really what you're looking for. To test this antenna, I have it mounted in the usual spot, 17 feet in the air, facing the direction of my local broadcast towers. All the stations in my area broadcast on the VHF band, and I'm about 7 miles from the broadcast towers. To check the signal strength of this antenna, I'm going to test it first with the reflectors angled backwards as suggested by the manufacturer, and then I'm going to flip them around and test the signal strength with those reflectors angled forward, just to rule out if there's any difference between those two configurations. And checking the signal strength test results, first we will look at the signal with those rear reflectors reversed as suggested by the manufacturer. Low VHF channel 2 CKPR had a reasonable signal in the mid to high 50s, no pixelation. Channel 4, a different story though. CHFD had a very poor signal, anywhere from the high 30s to the low 40s with heavy pixelation. This channel was totally unwatchable. Channel 9 had a much better signal with a signal strength anywhere from the low to mid 70s. And now looking at this antenna signal strengths with the reflector facing forward in a more traditional way, the change overall was not good, unfortunately. Low VHF channel 2 actually slightly dipped a couple of percent and had a signal strength in the mid 50s. Channel 4 fared slightly better, however. The signal came up to the mid 40s. I would say this channel was semi-watchable with minor pixelation. And channel 9, which I expected a lot more out of, dropped 10 to 12%. Signal went from the mid 70s down to the low 60s. So overall, not very impressive signal strength tests either way. Just to make sure I was being extra fair with this antenna, I also tested it with the VHF reflectors completely collapsed to see if that made any differences with the signal. For VHF channel 2, the signal kind of stayed the same, somewhere in the mid 50s. The signal on channel 4 improved. The picture finally stabilized as opposed to all that pixelation that I was getting in the earlier tests, with a signal strength in the mid to high 50s and an EPG guide that apparently is stuck on repeat. And channel 9, about the same, still in the low to mid 60s. Doesn't seem to be any sweet spot with this antenna. The signal results were kind of all over the place no matter what I did to those VHF reflectors. Just for comparison's sake, I did a full review of the Televes V-Zenit mix antenna a while back, and the signal strengths on the same channels were much higher on the Televes. Channel 9 had a signal up into the 90s, in fact, whereas with this model from Multicomp Pro, the signal topped out in the 70s. The low VHF channels 2 and 4 also had much better signals with the Televes model. If you want to see that review, there's a link in the description. Even the mileage claim on the box is really high, 60 miles. This is more like a 25-mile antenna. It might work okay for strong UHF TV stations in a city or close suburban reception situation. But my advice would be to stick with a reputable brand like Televes, Winegard, Channel Master, even RCA. All of those names have a range of antennas that will give you good reception on all TV bands across a variety of reception situations. Bottom line, this Multicomp Pro antenna is a big miss in my opinion. I buy all the TV antennas I review on my channel with my own money, and this is one I regret even spending a nickel on. Based on the signal strength performance, something is off about this antenna. I don't know if it's the geometry or spacing of the elements, something to do with the reflectors, or maybe the active element itself. Something is just not right with this antenna. I've tested many other outdoor antennas of comparable size or even smaller that have had better VHF performance than this one from Multicomp Pro.